The water spurted out when he turned the tap. Small miracle. Garbage stopped being picked up 2 days ago, and God only knows how long before the water shut off. But still, they were prepared for the inevitable. Jugs of spring water Mr. Ross kept in the cellar would last them about a couple months. Maybe through the summer and a bit into autumn if they played their cards right. And the idea about bottling rainwater had been brought up every so often if things got desperate. George took a sip, cold with an odd taste of metal, but refreshing nonetheless. In places like Naperville up the country, he heard that running water had gone the way of steady electricity and emergency services. There were some remnants of the local sheriff's office drifting around here and there, so he had heard. Half of them were sent out to the larger cities to quell unrest. About a third of the rest, George recalled, were either mentally unfit to continue service or had joined the ever-growing number of American citizens in mass spiritual exodus. Or whatever it was the last few newsmen left on the air were calling it nowadays. Band-aids, something to soften the blow. He was glad he didn't watch too much TV anyway, lucky man. His former neighbor above him, a mild-mannered supermarket manager by the name of David Porter, had been unfortunate enough to have seen the news the first day everything came out. The last time anyone in the complex had seen Porter, he had walked out the door in choking sobs, headed down the street one frozen night, and was never seen again. His belongings collecting dust in his room, his car frozen under the big cypress tree in the lot stained in bird droppings. The knock at the door didn't surprise him. George knew who it was without even having to guess.
Georgie? Hey, Georgie, you still in here?
The quiet voice of Alexander Ross was enough to break the silence of the apartment.
I, got some lunch for you, if you're interested.
The small, wiry frame of the Brook Hill Meadows apartment landlord entered the room, leathery spotted hands shakily holding a tin-foiled covered plate that smelled faintly of savory barbecue sauce. For a man of 79, Mr. Ross moved rather quickly, shuffling into the room with the pace of someone who felt that they couldn't stop moving, or else they would sit down and die. He laid the plate down on the coffee table, and his dark brown eyes looked at George through thick, lightly scratched lenses.
It's Sloppy Joe's today, Georgie. Last of the beef we got before it went bad.
Mr. Ross gave a chuckle that seemed both strained and half-hearted.
And there was a few cookies in there, you know, from Alice's jar of 'em. I appreciate it, Mr. Ross.
George took the tinfoil off and examined the plate's contents. A Sloppy Joe sandwich, a pitiful handful of ground beef drenched in an excess of neon orange canned sauce, served alongside a few doughy lumps of chocolate chip cookies. A meal fit for royalty, no doubt.
But you don't have to keep doing this, you know? I mean, I'd hate to be taking food from you and Mrs. Ross without returning the favor.
Mr. Ross waved a wrinkled hand in the air, as if to brush away any imaginary concern.
Nah. If I didn't want to feed you, Georgie, I wouldn't. Heck, just you being here is enough to repay the both of us. I don't know what we'd do if it was me and Alice.
George nodded and patted the old man's shoulder, making sure to put on the best smile he could. He was of course very grateful to Mr. Ross, but the situation still made him feel guilty. Reaching down, he grabbed the sandwich, and with sauce dripping onto his hands, the man sat on the couch. Mr. Ross joined him, and the two sat there in silence, staring at the long dead clock in desperate prayer that it would once again make some kind of noise to break the stillness.
So, how is Mrs. Ross doing? She's doing better, right? Oh, Alice? Yeah, day by day,
Mr. Ross said, his voice straining with the faintest flicker of optimism, in the same way a car struggles on a precious few drops of gasoline.
She remembered her birthday yesterday, and her sister's. Making progress. Last month I had to keep her from burning herself on the stove. You know, back when we still had decent power. And now she's remembering dates again.
Another chuckle to muffle a sigh.
Day by day, Georgie. Day by day. You ever try give her medication? I remember reading about giving folks with
George stopped himself mid-sentence on reflex.
With memory issues, medication to help clear him up. You think that would help? Nah. See, it's not so much a memory issue as it is a...
Mr. Ross searched for a word he wasn't sure even existed.
It's not like she forgets, that she really can't remember. She can remember if she wants to, but most of the time she thinks it's better to try and push them all back down. Not that I don't blame her. I mean, when we saw what was going on, all those god-awful things...
He gulped and shook his head, closing his eyes.
I was in the war way back when, Georgie, you know? So maybe I can deal with it better. But, I don't know. Everyone deals with it in their own way. At least she's getting better,
George said, trying to sound as comforting as he could.
All that matters, right? Besides, I'm here if you need help with her.
The flicker of a genuine smile, something George had almost forgotten he had seen Mr. Ross wear in the last 5 months, appeared on the landlord's face. He was right, of course, about people dealing with the news in their own way. It wasn't so much that someone could handle what they've seen. Hell, no one could see those pictures of those naked, emaciated children huddled half-feral like wild alley cats in those dark, filthy tunnels without something in them changing. But the question of how they dealt with it. For some, like dear Alice Ross, who used to spend her Sundays at the church bingo and never had an unkind word to say about anyone, the only alternative to cope with what they saw was total regression. Better than the other alternatives, but the woman who once boasted she was a master at solving the Sudoku puzzles in the Times Journal now sat and giggled and gawked like a wild-eyed toddler. In between unpredictable periods of sudden and unprovoked sobbing, she would either lay in bed and shriek and kick for colouring books, or for what little candy may have been left, or she'd wander the apartment wide-eyed and cooing. Everything child-proof now. God only knows what would happen if she tried to use the stove, or put something in her mouth she wasn't supposed to.
Get anything?
Mr. Ross asked, quick to change the subject.
On the radio, I mean. Anything good out of St. Louis? Same old, same old. I heard police are still evacuating people from St. Louis. Take them to Carbondale, or somewhere near Joliet. And last I checked, the military's just in Grand Rapids since Thursday.
Lies, of course. George hoped he kept a convincing tone of voice, for lying had never been his strongest skill. St. Louis was a bust. Last he heard over the radio was an amateur news report from some quivering operator saying that the cops had taken to shooting both crazies and each other, and that the Eads Bridge was a pileup of cars like a grotesque logjam. And forget about Grand Rapids. He hadn't heard anything since last Thursday, save for dead static. The last of what he did hear was that the violence had spilled out of Detroit, and most of Palmer Park and New Center were currently smoldering by now.
That's good.
Whether or not Mr. Ross genuinely believed what George had told him, even George wasn't sure. Easier to accept the lie at this point, perhaps.
That means maybe someone will come soon. Put a stop to all the craziness. Yeah, I'm sure.
Again, there was silence. There was a few times Mr. Ross seemed to muster the courage to say something, but whatever it was, he never got beyond a pathetic hand gesture or a muffled half-syllable. He wanted to talk about something, anything, although he could find nothing to really say that hadn't been said before. Eventually, once George finished his sandwich, that seemed to be a good time for Mr. Ross to accept that he would need to leave soon.
All right, seems I ought to get back to Alice.
His voice seemed a bit more somber, like he had been told he had been drafted.
I, put a little something in her orange juice earlier. Help her sleep better. She should be waking up, and I want to be there if she needs anything. You sure you don't need help, Mr. Ross? No, I'd hate to bother you, Georgie. Like I said, I'm just glad you're here for the company. That's more than I can ask of anyone at this point. Well, all right then. Just let me know if you ever do need anything.
The two men shook hands and, as if with a much slower gait in his step than how he entered, Alexander Ross slipped out of George Hudson's apartment and shut the door behind him. The man arrived late in the day, coming in off the country road across the unkempt lawn like a refugee. He had come dishevelled and dirty onto the building's front porch, and it was only by laying out the hunting rifle he carried on his back that either man came out to greet him. His clothes were ragged and torn and smelled faintly of gasoline, and he pleaded to both George and Mr. Ross that he was not a violent man, only wanting some food if they had any. Mr. Ross offered the man a can of sliced peaches from his pantry, and George a bottle of lukewarm water, both of which the man consumed greedily before he sat down, peach juices dripping onto his filthy jacket onto the porch steps.
"Thank you both again,"
the man said, crushing the empty bottle in his hands as if to squeeze precious drops from it.
"I know both of you probably don't get much traffic around here. I know how it looked with me coming up the drive like that. Nah.
Mr. Ross hand-waved the man's apology away and gave a reassuring chuckle.
If I didn't want to feed ya, I wouldn't. Hell, if you wanted to hurt either of us, you'd have done it by now. At least you had the decency to ask us first." "Where are you heading from again?"
George asked, a tone of incredulous suspicion seeping through a voice that tried to be polite.
"Indiana, right? Long walk from there to Illinois." "Yeah, I'm from Indiana, though I didn't walk all the way."
The man reached into the ratty backpack he had been carrying and pulled out a crumpled, water-faded box of cigarettes.
"I had a car, but it only made it to Hammond before I ran out of gas."
He tapped the bottom of the box, and 3 cigarettes as ragged as the man himself popped out.
"Smoke? Least I can do for you two."
George and Mr. Ross took one each. The cigarettes were damp and tasted as if they had been wet and then dried again, but neither man could remember having a smoke since March, and they relished the tobacco regardless of quality. The 3 men stood on the porch under the summer sun, and for a brief moment, there was a sense of uncanny normalcy in the air.
"And where are you going to?" "Missouri. I hear it's not bad out there as it is heading out east."
The man blew out smoke and a dry, humorless chuckle.
"I'd take anything out there other than what the hell's going on in New York or D.C. You heard what happened in Manhattan, right? 3 straight days of lynchings. There were people hanging from the front of Lincoln Tunnel by their feet." "No. Last we ever heard from New York, it was that the mayor tried to leave through JFK. Who do you think they were lynching?"
There was silence again. The birds sang overhead without notice to what was just said, and the summer wind blew warm against their faces. The man ashed his cigarette and looked off into the distant horizon, where the hills still stood green and pristine, as if there was some kind of heaven just beyond them.
"You ever wonder why they do those kind of things anyway?" "People are violent, I guess."
George shrugged.
"You see what all those people were doing, for years no less, and you're gonna have people who want to make them pay." "Yeah, but if it was just that, you'd think they'd only go after the bad folks. You know, the abusers, the money men, you get the idea."
The man ashed his cigarette again and seemed to consider another one from the pack.
"My guess is just that they think they're doing each other a favor." "Favor?"
Mr. Ross grimaced beneath his thick glasses.
"By burning down their cities and shooting each other up?" No. Well, actually, yes. It's kind of like putting a dog out of its misery, you know? Or like someone dying of cancer on life support. It's pulling the plug. I'm not following you. Here, let me give you an example. I knew a guy way back when all of this started happening. When the news broke about all of them bodies out in Florida, right? This guy, he got his wife and kid. No, not a kid. More like a baby, let's say. A nice house in Fort Wayne. They all had good jobs, whole 9 yards. They never bothered no one, and they always followed the rules to a T. They never broke any laws, never stayed out late, and always showed up on time for work. A-class people all around. Now, one day, someone in the family, let's say the father for instance, learns something terrible, something absolutely god-awful. It's not like he learned that he lost his job or that his mother just died. Those are horrible, yeah. But this is something that genuinely shakes him.
He struggled to find the words for a moment.
It changes him. In about, I don't know, 30 minutes of sitting in front of the TV, this man realizes that he lives in a world with awful, disgusting, degenerate people. People who do atrocious things to other people. Who have been doing atrocious things to other people for years and years. That while he was out in a 9-to-5 doing everything he was told, things were going on that were so horrible, they would have never even crossed his mind. It kind of wakes him up to the world he's living in, you see?
For a second, George swore the man was reaching for his rifle, and he moved his hand to the pistol he kept in his pocket. He was relieved then that the man was merely reaching for another cigarette.
Now, this guy, it's like his entire worldview has been shattered. It's one thing to hear rumors about this sort of stuff, like someone telling you they think your wife is running around on you or something. But to see it all in color, undeniable, clear as day right on his TV, well, he's got to really come to terms. And that's the hardest part for him, is coming to grips with the fact that this is the world. This is reality. He's seeing everything for what it is. The problem isn't that he can't handle it. He can handle it fine. Man of the world and everything. But what about his wife? Does she know about this? She's always had a warm and loving personality. Maybe a bit naive about some stuff, yeah, but she makes up for it. How could such a sweet, loving, and kind woman like her live in a world where people can make money off letting people act like animals? Like a butterfly in someone's fist? And what about the baby? Could you even imagine what kind of father he would be if he let his kid grow up in a world like this? What kind of man would he even be?
The traveller turned and looked at both George and Mr. Ross, like a teacher expecting their students to follow along. The cigarette hung from his mouth, and the smell of the building's trash pile on the curb mixed with the scent of dandelions and the traveller's clothes.
You know what he did? What did he do? He shot them both. What else would he do? They'd never know what he knew, and even if they did, it wouldn't bother them anymore. What happened to the guy? I don't know. Last I heard about him, he torched his house and went south. I think following the interstate. 1 in a million by now.
Tenant and landlord stared at the traveller in front of them, watching as he looked out once more to the horizon, dark eyes wary and distant.
That's all any of these people are doing. Putting each other down so they don't have to live with it anymore. Maybe put the whole damn world out of its misery. Do you think that's the right thing to do? Take someone else's life because you think it'll help them?
The man shook his head and crushed the cigarette against the warm stone.
Who's to say? You could ask a priest about it if you're one of those spiritual types. But I passed a church out in Naperville way, and most of the congregation decided to go home back to God. I'm not too sure about nothing anymore myself.
Mr. Ross grimaced at that, and George wondered if he should do the honours of telling the traveller to leave. Throwing out his own cigarette, he took the traveller's empty canteen before bending down to meet his face.
Here, if I give you some food and fill your canteen, will you get going already? I'd be happy to.
So George filled the man's canteen with some of his water and gave him 2 cans, one of tuna and the other of stewed tomatoes, and the man graciously thanked both his hosts with the promise he'd be sure to write if there was anything actually left out in Missouri. As the man hobbled, rifle and backpack over his filthy clothes, into the late afternoon sun to fade into nothing, Mr. Ross looked up at George with a puzzled expression on his face.
Hey, Georgie. Yeah? Where did that fella say he was from again? Indiana. No, I know that. But where did he say he was from exactly? Fort Wayne. Oh.
The 2 men stared out at the horizon until the man was no longer even identifiable amid the searing blue backdrop. They went back inside and locked the door behind them. The past few days were hotter than usual. Each day a mystery now that most of the news channels were off the air, and there was no one left to worry about such a silly thing as weather. The outdoor thermometer read that it was 95 by early morning on Saturday, and for 3 days it never dipped lower. A sick, suffocating heat at that. One that stilled the air and condensed into an invisible sludge that filled one's lungs and sucked the water from them. The power had finally died 2 days earlier. The air conditioners sat dead in the windows, and the refrigerators emptied and their meager contents placed in heavy plastic coolers with the bags of half-melted ice. Mr. Ross had suggested sleeping in the basement, where it would be marginally cooler. But since the sewage stopped, a terrible odour lingered just beyond the cellar steps and seeped into whatever furniture or refuse was left. The clothes they wore would become damp with sweat, and as there was no washing machine, they had taken to soaking them in a bucket of soapy stale water for a few hours, and then letting them dry in the windowsills. But the nights were slightly more forgiving. The oppressive heat of the day gave way to a somewhat cooler darkness that at least allowed the mercy of an evening breeze. In the few precious hours between dusk and full night, George and Mr. Ross were sat out on the back porch. Each held in his hand a can of gently chilled beer that they sipped from with increasing savour, as if the next sip would finally overpower their senses and spare them from their situation.
You know, I never realized how wide the country is.
Mr. Ross pointed to nothing in the wide darkness, a vast dark portal that was once kept at bay by streetlights and the glow of distant houses now vacant.
Really just goes to show how alone we are out here. At least we're not in the cities.
George nodded, his expression stoic and firm in the light of the antique oil lamp on the table between them.
We'd rather be alone than dealing with the...
He decided to spare Mr. Ross the details, for he knew that the old man already knew.
Is she okay? Your wife? She seemed like she was having a fit. Alice? She's fine.
Mr. Ross spoke as if the mere suggestion of his wife hurt him.
It's just, I guess she used to be scared of the dark when she was a kid, an actual little girl. Now that she's all...
A pause.
Confused, as she is, she just gets scared when there's no light. I found an old camping lantern, one with batteries, and that helped stop her carrying on.
He took another long sip of his beer. His thick glasses caught in the light, and for a moment, George could see them clearly. Brown eyes filled with the kind of desperation that only tired men had. A desperation for something or someone to just stop the goddamn noise and draw the curtains already. The reality of the situation was setting in, and this man had finally come to realize his place in it.
God, how long it's been since everything started. A few months, right? I'd say so. It's funny. I thought after about a month, everything would settle down. There'd be a lot of fighting and noise. Maybe a couple people would start some riots. But after a while, everyone would come back to their senses and go back to normal. Alice and I, we had plans to go to Michigan on vacation, out near the lakes, remember? Right around this time, just a month or so of everyone getting themselves worked up, and then... I don't think you'd want life to go back to normal after all that came out. There were people.
George grimaced a bit. It was so commonplace now, but still, to say it out loud felt profane.
All of that raping, and the killing, and the eating...
He trailed off, as if he were a child and able to describe their nightmare.
Not everyone would want to just brush it all off and go back to business. I know. It's just, you'd think people would try to act civilized, wouldn't you? I mean, we're still human beings, damn it. Just because some people can't doesn't mean we all have to.
Mr. Ross grit his teeth behind pursed lips, remembering the footage he had seen of a group of men covered in blood and each carrying a firearm in trembling anticipation, pulling open a heavy door to a large, dark concrete cell. In the harsh glow of flashlights and cameras, reporters and deputies stood awestruck, not just at the collection of bones in haphazard piles like children's blocks, but also at the sheer variety of sizes and shapes that composed them. The floors and walls were smeared in dark, unidentifiable liquid long since dried and seeped into the brickwork, and some of it spilled from rusted metal pails to streaking black rivulets around a bulging drain in the center of the room. He remembered when the reporter woman stepped onto something softer than brick or bone, and suddenly let out a scream with such raw terror behind it that she lost her face and heaved. He remembered with disturbing, unmerciful clarity the way the camera focused on the pale, bloated face of a girl no older than 11 years. Glassy eyes staring at the world from underneath swollen purple eyelids, and glistening like the flies that crawled along the raw pink flesh of her exposed gums from where a lower lip should be. She had been deceased for only a few months. That was somewhere right outside of Texas, and from what he could remember, there were further tunnels branching out from San Antonio. In Chicago, about an hour and a half from here, there had been talk of some sort of tunnel underneath Union Station that led to what was described only as abattoir, and that the one officer who stepped inside had to be restrained by his colleagues in a panicked fit. Mr. Ross had never seen it, but he was sure that's what Alice had seen when he found her half screaming and bawling behind the couch.
Maybe it's one of them, domino effect. People saw violence, and they responded with violence. Then other people saw the violence, those people were starting, and then they started. Maybe that's why all of this is going on for so long. Going until the last man standing so they can't hurt each other no more. I think it's them acting how they feel. Nothing left to do but just smash and burn and fight. It could be like what the guy told us a couple days ago. One big mercy kill. Put the whole world out of its misery. But honestly, I'd say it's because people want to be punished. That they want to face some sort of retribution. If they let all that stuff happen and never did anything about it, they probably feel ashamed.
George looked at the fire in the lantern, burning thinner every moment inside the curved glass.
Maybe everyone feels like they deserve it in some way, and shooting each other and burning their houses down is everyone punishing themselves. You'd think good people wouldn't want to be punished. Everyone has to deal with it somehow, I suppose. Did you ever hear more about Grand Rapids? You never heard any more out of there? Not since the batteries died. I don't think there were any new developments. Oh.
The two men sat again in silence. The dusk had finally broken, and the last streaks of orange that colored the horizon had finally faded into darkness that swallowed up everything save the first two steps of the patio. They stared out at the darkness, clasping their now nearly empty cans as if they were the last two possessions either man would own.
Where do you think everyone else is, Georgie? Who? The other tenants, you mean? Yeah, I don't know about David. No one knows where he ran off to. But there was Jeff, Danny, and Carol, Ben and Maria, the Josephs.
Mr. Ross shook his head, looking back at the rows of empty apartments behind them for a lingering moment.
I think Jenny's with her folks in Wisconsin, and we know what happened to Dougie. We found him on his couch. I'm sure they're fine. They were good people. Danny told me before he left he had cousins just an hour from here, and the Josephs said they were heading north. I hope so, Georgie. God, I hope so.
He looked at George with a somber smile, one that seemed both faint and genuine all at once.
I appreciate you staying at least, Georgie. I hope we're not keeping you here. Nah, Mr. Ross, not at all. If I wanted to leave, I would have done it. Though we're running low on food, it's probably not going to be enough for 3 of us unless we start seeing if the other apartments got stuff left over in the cabinets. We'll be fine for about a couple more weeks, give or take.
George sipped the last of his beer and relished the somewhat cool taste. He patted the landlord's shoulder in a way reminiscent of a father comforting a son, a stronger man trying to be reassuring.
We can figure it out from there. Look on the bright side. At least it's just us out here. Blessing and a curse, I suppose. Hopefully, someone comes soon.
A shrill, pathetic whining broke the quiet of the night. It was loud, bawling, the sound of an older woman mimicking the high-pitched shriek of a toddler. It would have surprised the two men had they not been used to it by now. At the sound, Mr. Ross tensed, and he closed his eyes with a grimace spreading across his wrinkled, tired face. He clenched his beer can tight enough that the aluminium crumpled in his fingers, and he sat there in stillness for several seconds, as if trying to summon the will to investigate.
Please, Christ, I hope someone comes soon.
Mr. Ross finished his beer in one swig, and he tossed the can without direction into the darkness. He wished George a decent rest of the evening, and promised, with a wariness in his voice that bordered on barely hidden apathy, that he would see his tenant tomorrow morning. The old man stood up and, without much speed, he vanished back into the choking, shrieking darkness of the building and into his room. George sat outside, his companion the slowly dying flame in the oil lantern. He listened to the sounds of Mrs. Ross shrieking and babbling about supposed monsters she had imagined in the darkness, in her usual dribbling coo, as Mr. Ross's muffled voice tried to appease her. He looked back out into the darkness, just beyond the patio, and for a moment, his mind turned to the cities, the towns not far from here, where the streets ran with wild men naked and hysterical, like shaved cattle in a slaughterhouse chute. The fires that burned through mansions and apartments and slum houses, fueled by endless underground gas lines and fed by shrieking participants, a diet of bodies and garbage. People that lay curled up in hospitals and mental clinics, long abandoned rocking on bed-sored anuses, that they were sorry, that they had no idea, and if they knew, they would have done something. Hundreds of millions of people turned overnight into incoherent lunatics in an act of unbelievable mental defense. The mind faced with information so grotesque that it would have never even been imagined by the average person shutting down. A total reset of the personality, morals, and values in a frenzied, final attempt to process this information, this putrid awareness of the world and its nature, in a way the person could live with. George looked back at the apartment building, a nearly vacant tomb whose walls were now always dark and humid, and whose only inhabitants were him and the elderly couple, who seemed in some way ashamed to have still been alive to see this. He stared back then at the dark country, vast, wide, and limitless, where the untouched, now alien forests of trees and animals, untouched by the boundlessly creative depths of human savagery, and the highways littered with the remains of a once better world not too long ago, merged into a single unbroken expanse that now lay just beyond the porch steps. He considered something for a while until the flame in the oil lantern at last became a single orange spark that gasped one measly breath and died. George listened and noticed that the infantile sobbing of poor Mrs. Alice had finally stopped, replaced with the rhythmic chittering of crickets and the ceaseless rustle of a wind that smelled faintly of burnt rubber and smoke. George walked back into the building and left the door unlocked behind him. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy these stories, be sure to click subscribe and check out some more stories here.